Yeah, please. Just remove it.
Right, so we're going to begin by looking at Immanuel Kant's deontological ethical theory. Immanuel Kant is an Enlightenment thinker. The Enlightenment was a period in Western thought where people recognized the use of science as a way of kind of figuring out the world, emphasizing reason, logic, mathematics, and rational thought, as opposed to superstition, faith, and scripture. And therefore, an Enlightenment thinker, such as Kant, is one who puts great emphasis on reason, autonomy, thinking for oneself, and not relying purely on tradition, faith, or superstition. Kant had a deontological approach to ethics, and when we say deontological, we mean that it was based on duty, and therefore we have a kind of moral obligation to obey certain moral principles. Kant's ethical theory can be described as absolutist, and therefore moral actions are right or wrong regardless of the consequences or regardless of the situation or circumstance. Kant thought that not only was the action important in establishing the morality of a given ethical choice, but also the intention behind the action. And the way in which he described this is that an action must have a good will. Kant says that a good will shines forth like a precious jewel. He says that it's the only thing that is intrinsically good in and of itself. And what Kant meant by good will is that we must be motivated by the right intention. That actually the thinking or the motive behind an action is as important as the action itself. And he says that the only thing we can or should be motivated by is duty. Now, Kant is going to tell us a little bit later what our duty is, but he says that we should not be motivated by emotion, number one. Why should we not be motivated by emotion? Well, he says that emotion ultimately clouds our judgment. Emotion is something subjective, and therefore it's not a consistent way of making moral decisions. For example, Kant says that you should not give money to charity because you feel some kind of emotional guilt or sense even of compassion or altruism. We shouldn't be motivated by emotion, only duty. And therefore you have this kind of strange situation where you might give money to charity, but if you do it for the wrong reason, the whole moral action is actually rendered immoral, which is quite peculiar for many people. Okay, so the intention is really important. Kant says we should be motivated by duty. Okay, well, what is duty? Well, I think first of all it's important to distinguish between what's called a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative. Now, a hypothetical imperative is a conditional command. And therefore, in a moral sense, a hypothetical imperative is a moral command that is conditional on something else being achieved. For example, murder is wrong if you get caught. See how it's conditional on a particular end or outcome happening. It might be stealing is acceptable if it's to feed your starving family. That's an example of a hypothetical imperative. Utilitarians will adopt hypothetical imperatives all the time because they will say that an action is only good if it's dependent or it's conditional on achieving a particular outcome. Now Kant says morality is not hypothetical in nature. If you're claiming that morality is based on hypothetical imperatives, you're wrong, says Kant. It can only be based on what's called the categorical imperative, and therefore this is an unconditional moral command. Categorical imperative. Okay, so doing our duty is following the categorical imperative. Kant breaks this down further by saying there's actually three formulations of the categorical imperative. The first formulation of the categorical imperative says that a maxim can only become a moral law if it can be universalized without contradiction. Therefore, the rightness or wrongness of an action is not dependent on the circumstance or situation. It has to be right for everyone at all times. when deciding whether an action is right or wrong, it's not just about you, but whether it be right for everyone, universally. This is the first formulation, universality. It has to be able to be universalized without contradiction. Okay. The second formulation of the categorical imperative is that we need to treat human beings as an end in themselves, never merely as a means to an end. This is sometimes called the humanity principle. And this is Kant's way of trying to protect the kind of value that all human beings possess. If you treat people as a means to an end that perhaps utilitarianism might endorse, you're exploiting, you're manipulating, and you're not respecting them and their value in and of themselves. Let me give you some examples. Kant would say that it's never acceptable to torture someone. Why? Well, because it doesn't respect them as a person. It doesn't respect their value. You're exploiting them for some other good or purpose. You're using them as a means to an end, and Kant therefore says that is immoral. You can never torture someone. Another kind of perhaps more trivial example might be you cannot lie, ever. Why? Because it uses people as a means to an end. Even in a situation like a shopkeeper lying to a customer or being falsely nice is actually immoral. You cannot lie. It's an absolute rule according to Immanuel Kant. Okay? And the third formulation of categorical imperative is something called the kingdom of ends. So Immanuel Kant says, when thinking about what is the moral law, you must imagine a utopian society where everyone is both a lawmaker and respected as an end in themselves as well. So, the kingdom of ends is Kant's vision for a kind of perfect and just society. And therefore it's not so much a new formulation, but as a way of understanding the first two criteria. Is this maxim or action something that is going to be a feature of a just society? Okay, that's a categorical imperative. So we've looked at enlightenment, reason, we've looked at goodwill, we've looked at the categorical imperative, and now we'll look at something called the three postulates. Now, Kant believes that in order for his theory to make sense, he needs to postulate certain things. To postulate is to kind of assume certain things to be the case. The first one that he has to postulate, or the first thing that he has to postulate, is that human beings are free moral agents. He has to postulate this because if human beings are not free to make their own decisions, they can't make genuine moral choices. And that seems quite an obvious point that's going to be relevant for all ethical theories. If you're not free, you can't make a moral choice. And therefore you can't have an obligation to do something. A famous quote we use with Kant is, ought implies can. Ought implies can. If I have an obligation to do something, I must be free and have the potential to fulfill this obligation. Okay, first postulate. The second postulate is that of immortality, that the soul will exist, or we will exist in some form after death. Now, why is that the case? Well, Kant believes that everyone ought to be virtuous. And if we ought to be virtuous, it must be possible to be the most virtuous, right? Because that's what we're working towards. Now, it must be possible to reach the highest good. And for Kant, the highest good is where virtue is rewarded with happiness, something that he calls the summum bonum. Now, Kant says that there are many people who follow their duty and who are virtuous in this life, but do not have the ability to reach the highest good. They can't reach the summum bonum, because we know that in life good people don't always get rewarded with happiness. And therefore Kant assumes, well, there must be happiness in the afterlife then. If it's not possible in this life, in order to achieve this potential, these good and virtuous people must be rewarded in the next life with what he calls the highest good, which is kind of happiness. If you like, it's perhaps what Christians might call heaven. kind of eternal reward or justice for those who follow their duty. Okay, and then the third postulate is something that is also necessary for his theory to work, which is that God exists. Now, Kant doesn't definitively claim God definitely exists, but he says, well, if we have the summum bonum, if we have the afterlife, there must be some kind of guarantor of the afterlife, and this has to be God. Obviously, God and the afterlife are kind of inextricably linked. You don't seem to have one without the other. This is the three postulates according to Immanuel Kant. Okay, so that's the kind of basic outline of Immanuel Kant in terms of AO1, knowledge and understanding, the fundamentals of his theory. Reason, goodwill, duty, categorical imperative, three postulates, and the summum bonum.